We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McInerney.
And this is Jeremy Rothschild.
Right now we are recording. It is Saturday night, December 5th. And last show we did, we looked at the trajectory and the terrain of some what we saw at the time, and we still do see at the time, some pretty ominous developments in terms of a complete shakeup of the Department of Defense, where you had the removal of Defense Secretary Mark Esper, which resulted in the bringing in of combination of Kash Patel, the hardline anti-Muslim crusader, and then obviously Ezra Cohen Watnick, the almost seems like right-hand man of some semblance, some form or another of the now recently pardoned General Michael Flynn. And we talked about in terms of a potential scenario with, say, even a President Donald Trump not leaving office or whatever that may or may not result in. We talked about what we described as what we labeled as a triumvirate of treason, and it was a combination of American domestic interest in terms of combination of the Council for National Policy and all of its interconnecting networks and operatives and operations going on, and then the two-sided foreign-centric 1-2 punch of Israeli Zionist interest and more Russian-centric interest. And perhaps that was a little simplistic on the foreign policy front. There's some other players that we may or may not have real strong grip or semblance on. But I feel like that was from the long-term, short-term and long-term right-wing operation, so to speak, in terms of how the right-wing power structures operated in this country. And my belief that more and more we're seeing like the Republican Party just become a complete operator on behalf of this very strong foreign-centric activity going on in this country and we'll talk more about that, I think, when in the very near future, based on a phone call that I made into C-SPAN earlier this week, where I laid out my theory of the Republican Party, the GOP, basically becoming a foreign-owned entity is how I described the phone call into C-SPAN. But in our last show, we talked about. But
will you describe that a little bit in terms of the information that you put out on C-SPAN in relationship to that?
Okay, so Monday morning I called into C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and the topic during the open line portion of the program was I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the exact topic in front of me. What is Donald Trump? Basically, what is Donald Trump's legacy in terms of how Donald Trump has affected the Republican Party and the GOP? And my response was, well, Donald Trump has been the finalizing of the Republican Party, the GOP, becoming a completely foreign-owned entity. And I mentioned four bullet points I focused on in this phone call. One was Donald Trump as a long-term, going back at least to the 1980s, asset, if not outright agent of Russian interests, Russian compromise operations. And then I mentioned, secondly, the long-term Council for National Policy agenda of basically moving the conservative movement in America closer to Russia in terms of culture wars and other aspects. And I specifically mentioned the late conservative activist Paul Weyrich and the Heritage Foundation, and really at the forefront of cultivating that relationship going back to the 1980s and on now into 2020, under the guise of the Cold War era hostilities with the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and going on from there. And then thirdly, I mentioned the Israeli-centric aspect of this operation, which I think more than anything else was epitomized by Breitbart, Made in America, Conceived in Israel, with all of the Mercer money and all that operation entails. And then finally, I mentioned the insertion of foreign money into our American political system, and particularly into the campaign coffers of Republican leading GOP politicians such as Mitch McConnell, House Leader Kevin McCarthy, and Senator Lindsey Graham, three people in particular who were not initially really down with the Trump agenda, so to speak. But then I think you could make a strong case as a result of foreign influence, whether it's Oleg Deripaska pouring money into the state of Kentucky in terms of I believe aluminum plants in Kentucky and other business endeavors that would benefit Senator Mitch McConnell, as well as Senator Rand Paul, who I think longer term has more been in league with this what I'm calling this ongoing operation, so to speak. But definitely Mitch McConnell, as well. You could
call it a mafia libertarianism.
There you go. And it fits right in with their whole like business is everything, economic philosophy as well. So you got McConnell, and then Lindsey Graham with whatever went on with that strange meeting at that golf course, and Lindsey Graham's fealty that went on with Trump afterwards. And there's a trail of money from I believe from Deripaska interest, as well as interest related to Mr. Leonard Blavatnik. And then finally Kevin McCarthy, the House leader, who went from saying that if Vladimir Putin owns Donald Trump and Dana Rohrabacher back in 2016 to being a complete subservient sycophant of all things Trump agenda. So those were the four pillars I laid out in this phone call into C-SPAN on Monday morning. I feel like that was a follow up on like what we talked about in terms of the triumvirate of treason, trying to bring in a long term and current perspective on what I call the complete transformation of the Republican Party, the GOP, into what I described in this phone call as a foreign-owned entity. And I believe that is a strong, a relevant follow-up to our conversation we had on what we labeled the triumvirate of treason, and trying to figure out like the forces in terms of this post-election chaos that we're bringing about perhaps a very dangerous moment, and still a moment that I think is dangerous, but that we perhaps have not changed our perspective on, but have somewhat, altered and evolved our perspective on based on the last few weeks of activity that has taken place since we last recorded.
Yes, I would say if I were Usain Bolt, the runner, I would say that call was devastating. And I think it was, it was unique in relationship to the whole time of the Trump years. That I believe that it was like the first time that whole package, the range of those facts and those figures were connected in answering this question that was on the table for that morning show. And so I applaud you for it. It was a great call, Greg. And we're going to work to actually play it on a future show. So people can hear it. And also I think it's a very good example of that kind of, of public information activism in a really raw way, and a very effective way. And, it implicates the GOP, but it also implicates C-SPAN to some extent too, in relationship to how little they've actually featured the kind of voices that could have, they could have featured authors who could have put some of these pieces on the table, and to a large extent they did not. And as we've always pointed out, we still appreciate that it's one of the few, public access, mass public fora available to the American people to both understand what, across the spectrum, what different people are thinking and feeling about things, but also to get your voice out there on key issues. And you can also, you can either call in during the open phones as you did, which really gives you the open space to answer the question in your own way. Or you can also call in when there's like figures on there that you want to ask a question, confront, that kind of thing.
I think you're right, because there could be some very, very serious analysts and people who have done some very serious research in the long-term trajectory of the right-wing conservative movement in this country, as well as the very real foreign and as laid out by people such as Seth Abramson, global operation in terms of the installation of Donald Trump as our president. And, maybe C-SPAN could feature more of those people rather than pussyfooting around with the likes of Ken Blackwell and Tom Fitzon in the future. But I'm not saying they will, but that would be like, if the C-SPAN were like a serious purveyor of truth in this generation. Although I do second your assessment that C-SPAN does provide a great service, and one way it does is that it gives you more of a perspective on what actual Americans feel and believe about the issues of our time than you get pretty much in any other, I would say, mainstream political, quote, news-oriented media, per se. But, there's still the glaring problem of C-SPAN has not been an accurate or anywhere near an adequate purveyor of actual serious what would pass for truth in this current moment, and pretty much since its conception with the rise of cable television to a mass audience.
Yes, and you also pointed out to me how it's also a very rich resource in terms of their entire archives of all of the videos that are there, where it's one of the few places you can find the raw footage of the think tanks talking to each other. For example, even that infamous Patrick Clausen, WinEP, how are we going to get an American president to war with Iran during Obama, with Dennis Ross sitting on that same panel, and maybe, I don't know, I can't remember who the president of WinEP is. That comes out of C-SPAN covering it, and it's all on the archives there. And people who do documentaries about neocons, like Robbie Martin, a strong piece of, a large portion of the raw footage to create documentaries like that comes from C-SPAN. So we are we have critical applause for C-SPAN, and but most importantly, we encourage folks to use C-SPAN, both the airwaves, the archives, all of that. So, and Greg, let's dip back into Blavatnik really quickly, because I think he's a crucial figure in the potential close of the Trump era. And although maybe we should talk a little bit more, we'll continue to dig a little bit deeper into the moment, what's still the threats going on right now in terms of, all the generals calling for mass sedition and martial law and the overthrow of the regular format of the U.S. government and all of that. That's still, it's being talked about in public. And at the very least, you can go, John Brisson has been doing some programs about this, which is very interesting, playing clips and assessing it. And, one of the things that we talk about is how, Greg, you and me, we do have a certain, maybe an attachment, but a focus on rules and norms, that rules and norms are not just important for themselves, just as form per se, but they also are related to the possibility of the question of creating or resurrecting the concept of rule of law at some level. And so there is a sort of chaos, there's a chaos warfare, a destabilization operation that goes on just by the utterance of these high level, Thomas McInerney's, Michael Flynn types. Michael Flynn, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, formerly. I think it's the biggest intelligence agency in the U.S. government, I believe, actually. I'm almost positive. McInerney, number 3, high-level U.S. Air Force, up to number 3, part of key operations, bombing Libya in the 80s, right? Serious stuff going on. And these guys are, there's a whole parallel reality going on where everything has been flipped upside down. And as we begin to pick up on, as Alex Jones began to he turned his, he had a change of heart on his research about Garden Plot and the Rex 84 and all of the Oliver North crew and the question of planning for continuity of government and, with a planning for being able to put Americans into camps and all of that and we're in quote unquote worst case scenarios. And then halfway through the Trump regime, first 4 years, maybe last 4 years, it had a change of heart and was like, no, I misunderstood this the whole time. This was the anti-communist, the anti-globalists who were trying to, architect a way to be able to deal with, if the Chinese were to one of these days to cross the Rio Grande like Project Veritas founder with and attack the United States like I've been threatening for every single, year for years.
It's very similar to Alex's, his misunderstanding on September 11th and, until David Horowitz educated him on September 11th really it wasn't an effort to frame Muslims for an attack on America to start a perpetual never-ending series of never-ending war on terror. No, it was actually the radical Muslims working with the liberals in the West to destroy America.
And is there really any difference between the liberals and the communists? Really? No, come on. And
what we call the Mecca alliance.
And in the Trump era, the liberals and the communists have now been put into the monolithic conspiracy of the demon rats, right?
Although as we're seeing with this most recent uproar over prominent Republicans criticizing the super patriot MAGA attorney, Lynn Wood down in Georgia for saying Republicans shouldn't vote in the Georgia primary. Then you can very quickly see, even, the Newt Gingriches and the Breitbarts of the world become, demon rat enablers, even though they've done everything in their power to, obviously be the leading way in terms of defending and shilling for all things Trump. So that's a bit of a digression, but it fits into this whole narrative of where anybody who is seen as even slightly opposed to dear cult leader, chairman, daddy Trump in any way, shape, or form becomes a demon rat enabler. But
well, will you put on the table that story of Blavatnik?
Yes, I will.
In 2019, it's from 2019, right?
Yes, because I was alerted to this. I was listening to the Sarah Kendzior on the podcast Gaslit Nation, which our listeners, I'm sure a lot of our listeners would not agree with everything stated on that program, but in terms of their own personal political ideologies and their worldviews. But it's been I would say Gaslit Nation, Sarah Kendzior in particular, along with the co-host Andrea Chalupa, has been an extremely valuable and I believe prescient observer of the current situation and just the dangers of particularly this Trump operation actually poses domestically as well as globally. The domestic threat, I think, that really becomes out of this. So I think that podcast I would recommend for people is as this great source of a prescient analysis of the actual dangers of the moment we're facing from a bigger picture perspective in terms of actual things that we could only imagine coming to America in the past actually becoming a reality. The things that you only hear about in the worst of third world banana republics, so to speak. And so anyway, I was alerted to this that I knew we had touched on the article, the work that came out of from the website Bellingcat in October of 2019. U.S. politicians can't stop taking Len Blavatnik's money, which is a deep dive by the way, the journalist titled, the author of this article is a journalist by the name of Casey Michael, Michel is his last name. Might be Michelle. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. But anyway, his Twitter handle is at CJC. I'm going to say Michelle here. Casey Michelle.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, this article from October 2019, and we've touched on it here, and I believe we touched on an Allison Weir article, which I kind of followed up on this information about Blavatnik actually from the great activist Allison Weir, and we can look back through and provide the links to these articles in our show notes that we'll place and post when we post this program onto our platforms. But anyway, this article it's a very in-depth article of by financial contributions from Leonard Blavatnik to both Republicans and Democrats. On one hand, Kevin McCarthy's Victory Fund is mentioned, but at the same time, many donations to leading Democrats is mentioned. Particularly mentions a $124,250 donation that was given from Blavatnik and his wife Emily to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC. Not only was it the second largest single donation Blavatnik has ever made to a U.S. politician or committee, but combined with his wife's donation, it totaled as much as any other individual donation that DCCC has ever received in its entire history. And this becomes very interesting because, as the aforementioned Sarah Kendzior was pointing out in her most recent podcast on Gaslit Nation, there was a serious, very Democrats in Congress led by, it appears, a California Congresswoman Jackie Spear,
maybe.
It's Jackie Spear. Okay. Jackie Spear was very vocal about investigating Leonard Blavatnik's business dealings, and particularly as it relates to Leonard Blavatnik and mob activity in many of its actions going on domestically and globally, particularly to tie the investigation into Stephen Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, and his ties to Deripaska and Blavatnik, and how really tying back the fact that this investigation never went anywhere, and linking that to Blavatnik's record-breaking donation to the Democratic the DCCC back in June of 2019. So this is something we understood, we figured out the significance of this article in terms of the Blavatnik donations to both Republicans and Democrats. But I believe this is a piece that we didn't pick up on, particularly at the time, was this particular donation coming in as it appeared that there was at least noise of a serious inquiry into the activities of Leonard Blavatnik and Oleg Deripaska by a prominent Democratic member of the House of Representatives.
Yes, and the article that you mentioned by Allison Weir, which was just a little bit after that article that you referenced, it was actually November 24th, 2019, titled World Jewish Congress Billionaires, Oligarchs, Global Influencers for Israel. And she goes through a whole bunch of activity going on at the World Jewish Congress, and touches on a lot of these characters, including Blavatnik. And at about the same time as that Casey Michelle article that you referenced, there's also a Mother Jones article by Dan Friedman titled A Soviet-Born Billionaire is Buying Influence at U.S. Institutions. Anti-corruption activists are worried. The Council on Foreign Relations is under fire for accepting Len Blavatnik's gifts thanks to his tie to oligarchs and Russian corruption. And, there's a reminder too that Blavatnik is heavily tied in. He was named as, on the periphery of the Netanyahu corruption investigation, I believe. And he is very tied in to Chabad networks and Israel too. And it's interesting, over the course of the years of the Trump regime, we've continually touched on Blavatnik at different points. We first began to talk about him in that first year where we were assessing the Mnuchin entrance into Treasury and the sales of Mnuchin's company, Dune, and how Blavatnik was taking his company's called Access, I think it's called Access Industries, and he's come, for a lot of these, former Soviet sphere oligarchs that we've been tracing and that are so tied in to this 11/9 investigation and Trump, who facilitated Trump and why. A lot of these networks, they are resource oligarch networks. And so Access Industries is an interesting name. And I'll just reread some from the Wikipedia page about Blavatnik. quote under his career. In 1986, Blavatnik founded Access Industries, an international conglomerate company located in New York, of which he is chairman and president. Access has long-term holdings in Europe and North and South America. Initially, he moved into Russian investments just after the fall of communism. He and a friend from university, Victor Vekselberg, right, put, star around that name, formed the Renova investment vehicle, and then the two joined with Mikhail Friedman's Alpha Group, put some asterisks around that name too, in that group, to form the AAR venture, right? Access, Alpha, Renova, right? Vekselberg, Friedman, and Blavatnik. Access has since diversified its portfolio to include investments in industries such as oil, entertainment, coal, aluminum, petrochemicals, and plastics, telecommunications, media, and real estate. And then also in relationship with finance. And he's very wealthy. Like they say he's the third wealthiest man in the UK. But they say he's worth $26.6 billion. And he bought in to, Hollywood holdings that Mnuchin was on his way out from in order to join, the Trump administration. And so there's, he's a key figure and then this, another story from that first year that we were looking at when we were investigating Blavatnik, which is very much related to what you just pointed out about this much more recent turn back to the Democrats, to potentially paying off the Democrats politically, really, it looks like, to drop investigations. And there's been lots of stories, you can go research it, but lots of stories about how sensitive he and his PR people are to being talked about in the press in a certain way. They will not grant interviews unless there's a guarantee that he won't be called an oligarch. He's very sensitive about that word. And of course, this relationship with Vekselberg going way back, there's a scene of them on a rooftop, I believe, maybe in New York or something like that, talking about the future. So they're close, and they go way back, and they come out of these, aluminum wars, which is, there's not a lot of talk of the, deep state, the black economy, the mob aspect here publicly. But this whole this is that network that there is the global, the laundering, there's the intersection, right, of business that is done in a lawful fashion, that includes the raping and pillaging of resources, obviously, it's legal. But it's also, as we know from the background of the Semyon Mogilevich and his relationship with Robert Maxwell, and Maxwell having apparently taught Mogilevich the global finance appropriate methods to setting up financial instruments that can work to launder vast amounts of money all around the world, right? And so this is the intersection of what we might call the Russian sphere deep state, the connection, and to update what I've been harping on for all these Trump years about let's especially during the continuing abuse of the term deep state, let's get the concept proper. Let's not just give it up to QAnon's late adoption of it, late abuse of it, basically. Let's bring it back to what it actually describes, and its legacy in thinkers like Peter Dale Scott. But so we should update it to basically say the deep state is not only the intersection between the national security apparatus of any sphere or government or national government, including mainly the covert operations, right? Where intelligence operations that are meant to be off book necessarily push towards financing it off books also, which would include black economy. And then there's very quickly the justifications for then controlling aspects of black economics in terms of drug flows, sex trafficking, and then how that then gets reincorporated, of course, into the usage of these sort of covert security apparatuses in terms of blackmail, abilities to move money, material all around the world too. So there's that. There's national security apparatus, but then as that whole phrasing suggests, in terms of thinking through how covert operations naturally lend itself towards an intersection with the underbelly of the economy, the criminal, organized criminal aspect of the economy, then you then deal with that, the global organized crime aspect. And that is so well known, even like from the people like the Noam Chomskys, who like to use all of the chatter around something like the Kennedy assassination to poo-poo it, be like, does it even matter if it was the mafia or a jilted lover, And so that the whole surrounding of deep state actions or deep politics, events of deep political events, state crimes against democracy, state crimes against minds, such as these assassinations, they're always they're bathed basically. And in many ways, you could say they're even hung out in a bad jacketed way, a dirtied up way, in the realm of the mafia, as Chomsky might call it, but that is not just a cover. That's also of course, once you're dealing with high level, national security, executive style actions, assassinations, false flag terrorism, you're dealing with immediately needing to have a cutout, a limited cutout at the same time. A cutout where you can have plausible deniability. So you have a layer of protection in terms of your own plausible deniability in relationship to an actual government official's role in something like that. Think of like in an American context, obviously someone like James Angleton or George H.W. Bush or Dulles in relationship to something like the Kennedy assassination. And then of course, then you bring in the mafia, and they both supply the many hands make light work aspect of deep state actions, but also the surrounding it with, this is just the criminal underworld. And so I like to add to those two pieces that I've been harping on over and over again in terms of national security apparatus, criminal underworld, as the deep state exists in intersectionality there, that we should then add in obviously this oligarchy, oligarchs, right? And that's why it's so sensitive to someone like Blavatnik, because and this is the same in an American sphere too, which you see most obviously in relationship to like with the super mob, the Jewish mob, the few neighborhoods in Chicago, for example, in Gus Russo's book Super Mob, where some Jewish immigrants from the Pale and Eastern Europe and Russia come to the United States in the 1800s largely, and you can sort of track like the big names that go through organized crime and that whole 20th century interesting first half story around the criminal syndicate and Meyer Lansky, the relationship to the Hoover and the FBI, the potential conjoinment with the Italian mob, right? And the mafia, the Cosa Nostra, the Kosher Nostra and the Cosa Nostra in engagement. And then, especially with the super mob, this really, intergenerationally evolved, let's say, the Jewish mob in the United States, specifically in terms of that described in Gus Russo's book, emanating, sort of organizing out of Chicago. You then begin to see, in addition to intersections with other groups like what were they called? The Purple, I forget the Purple Gang, right? This sort of Detroit, think of like Ohio, Columbus, the intersection then up to Canada and Montreal. And
Purple Gang would have been Mo Dallas, who was, I believe, awarded the Anti-Defamation League the Torch of Freedom. Isn't that right?
Right. And so that's actually the perfect example of what then happens is that it's all then washed, right? The mob is then washed in the next generation into philanthropy and into awards by so-called credible institutions like the Anti-Defamation League. And of course, if that's why that's one of the reasons why we went back and looked at the actual origins and the long-term machinations of groups such as like the ADL or the B'nai B'rith, and that they have been deep state from the beginning, right? They weren't like legitimate organizations that then in like the late 1900s got involved and then washing the reputation of the modalities. No, they were that from the beginning. They were deep state operations from the beginning, back to the conjunction of the Confederate intelligence and that whole background of B'nai B'rith and the Ku Klux Klan, and then the ADL, and tracing that very, very interesting and dark history throughout the 20th century, and that whole analysis that we did around the relationship of the, apparent Jewish deep state management in many ways via such organizations as the ADL, but also civil rights organizations, with the Jewish power very, either at the origins or very involved in managing civil rights, leadership, all of that kind of stuff. That whole background that we I'm sure we'll keep talking about it into the future, but just touching on that, then in the supermob context and an American context, you then see that this idea of oligarchy in the United States, there's a sensitivity, even like the same way that Blavatnik has it, being called an oligarch. There's an entire American establishment sensitivity to saying that we have anything such as oligarchs, American oligarchs or oligarchy. The polite way that it's talked about is plutocracy, plutocrats. And there's some fairness to that. And, what's interesting is like in the beginning of the Trump regime, I said that my suspicion was that Trump represented the first time in American history where the deep state had been flipped on its head, basically, where the underworld types, the black economy types, the organized crime types had actually like ascended and were now at the commanding heights over the national security state rather than the other way around, which I think it was always tied in together, of course. And it looks like someone like Hoover, for example, was very likely implicated, if not potentially deeply compromised via the Meyer-Lansky underworld. So I think it's more complex than what I'm saying right now, but that was my sense of it, that Trump brought in, this was where the underside of the deep state by, a bilayer complex had turned over and had gone to the top. And so, and I'd say so maybe in the potential end of this Trump years, I would say maybe that it was also the years where it became clear that that we went from American plutocracy to American oligarchy, and it became very obvious that we have oligarchs. Just like the post-Soviet sphere has oligarchs, we also have oligarchs. And though it's not quite as concentrated in the resource, just the oil, aluminum, not quite as focused around that. There's a lot more high finance. There's a lot more maybe cyber technology. But we still have the lineage and the legacy, both familial and business wise, in terms of our own American history of big business magnates and oligarchs. And, the Andrew Carnegies, the Rockefellers, that continues on into this day. It's just expanded into where cyber, like Netanyahu pointed out in terms of, I think it was this APAC presentation potentially, that things had changed in a drastic fashion in terms of the global economy, just like over the course of 10 years or something like that, where it had been almost all like big energy, companies, maybe defense companies, finance, and then over the course of 10 years, had basically become mainly high technology companies that were now in the commanding heights of Wall Street valuations and all of that. And so that's, I just wanted to address some of, that's some of the big structural stuff that I think, was on display during the Trump years. And I think we'll also then talk a little bit before we finish up, Greg, about let's say that it's possible that the McInerneys and the Flynns and the Trumps and the Kash Patels and the Cohen-Watnicks and now the Eric Princes, by the way, Trump has just apparently pulled American troops out of Somalia, but there is strong chatter that they're just sort of gone to next door, I think, maybe Kenya or something like that. They've just been drawn out of Somalia, but then the question is, Eric Prince, ready to go, right in the background, ready to go, ready to get facilitated. And so in the midst of all of that, it looks like maybe there's sort of it's a slop op. There's a slop op going on, not in terms of just like the amount of money that Trump has raised in refusing to say that he lost the election in some fashion. They've raised a lot of money. And so that's a sort of slop op potential, but there's also this other big slop op, like the international stuff around the weapons and what is going on. What are the deals that are going on in terms of all the activity of the Kushners and the Pompeos and, the visiting of the settlements and all the UAE and the Saudis and all of that, and then add on top of that, there is obviously some black ops stuff going on too, with the apparent Israeli escalation of the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist. Now there's also chatter and video that there is I haven't checked this. I don't know if this has been confirmed, and it's interesting. It has not gotten any real mainstream coverage that an apparent Mossad commander was assassinated on the streets of Tel Aviv. So it's very possible, if that's true, that was a proportional response by the Iranians in the midst of this escalation in the Israeli-Iranian sphere. But in general, the sense is that these are sort of slop ops on the way out, potentially, including whatever they're doing in terms of purging the Defense Policy Board and the Defense Business Board and putting all these guys in. And sure, we're not out of the woods in terms of martial law, as Alex Jones might want it to happen, or as Michael Flynn might call for, to suspend it, habeas corpus for who knows how long, just to do their election or whatever the heck they're actually doing. But, in general, my feeling is that they are sort of putting in a lot of combination of sucking resources out, emoluments. I mean, that was like one of the main concepts in terms of the Trump operation from a very personal and domestic fashion, was massive emoluments. Take advantage of statecraft for pumping hundreds of millions, if not billions, into their own family and their own friends, coffers, long-term business relationships, all of that. And so that's continuing on, it looks like, potentially on the way out. And so we're going to have to deal with the ongoing legacy, obviously, even if they're, let's say, this is all some kind of theatrics. It seems like that with a McInerney type. Sure, he was high level in the U.S. Air Force, but he's not really cogent. It doesn't seem like they're actually, these are networks that we've analyzed that are dangerous. They are operatively dangerous. So it's not like they can be just written off, but it seemed, remember what Flynn actually said, about this is hybrid warfare, right? And really that's a lot of what we see about this Trump operation, especially from like a Russian asset perspective, from what Putin was looking for it. And we still have to do our follow-up to a geopolitical analysis that I think will be helpful too, to explain where we are in terms of global geopolitics, geostrategy in terms of this question of the new nuclear regime that we're apparently under, the ending of the Clear Skies Treaty, what's Putin's understanding of what Trump did in relationship to the breakdown of the nuclear treaties. Apparently, it looks like too that a high level Russian next generation hypersonic nuclear engineer has been arrested for treason. I think I saw that just in the last day or so. So I don't know what that is all about, but it's resonant with the fact that this is a key piece of the legacy of what was done under Trump. So that's the international piece of it, I think, is that it recreated a more Wild West scenario where someone like Putin with his next generation hypersonic nuclear capacity could be back fully at the military table with the big boys, which would include China and the United States, in a way that he wasn't as long as it was all about like troops on the ground in the Middle East and all of that. Although they obviously made some presence in Syria and showed they could assert themselves there. But in terms of the reset of what all of these national elites are talking about in terms of great power competition, as we're sort of post global war on terror as the organizing concept geopolitically, geostrategically, and we're on to the great powers competition. So that's that piece. In a domestic fashion, it's obvious from what Flynn had said, we have digital, remember he said, we have digital warriors. Digital, basically militia is really the word that he was probably thinking of, that it was a hybrid, it was a militia-based, social media-based hybrid warriors, you might even call them. And, no matter how much poo-pooing there was of the Internet Research Agency by all of the 11-9 liars, we might call them 11-9 denialists, I don't know.
The hot dog vendor who once catered to Vladimir Putin.
Right. Like all Eric Prince does, actually, what all Eric Prince does is he sets up buffets in Africa so that people can eat. That's all he does. He's just a logistics guy for
and don't
setting
ask
up
about
buffets.
China, because that makes you a xenophobe who wants to start a war with China. So don't ask about Eric Prince, war criminal, uber war on terror, clash of civilizations. We're fighting a literal crusade against radical Islam, or against Islam. Don't ask about his leading, it appears, primary role in helping to architect this Chinese state repression of the Uyghur Muslim minority, because then you'd just be a xenophobe, and you don't want to be that.
No, but you're right, Greg. Like the minute that you say a critical word about the question of Chinese surveillance, technology, Uyghur Muslims, their usage of the war on terror paradigm, their own form of expansionism, it is, it's state, you could call it state capitalist imperialism for the anti-imperialists out there. And go talk to people around the world in terms of, sure, China's not that's why people might accept, certain groups of people might rather accept, if they had to choose between the state capitalist imperialism of the Chinese versus the corporatist capitalism of the United States, as it might be called, that especially in the 21st century is mainly associated with bombing the Middle East and spreading out drone strikes and depleted uranium, along with corporate looting of resources in the so-called third world. Yeah, sure, people will choose Chinese infrastructure and debt-based state capitalist imperialism, over that. But it's still, there's still critical words to be said of state capitalist imperialism if you're a real anti-imperialist, obviously, and that's not even like the our mode of critiquing things necessarily, but we're not afraid of going there either, But you're right, though, Greg, that it is a situation where if you say a word about against the rise of the Chinese techno tyranny, their relationship with Israel, their relationship to their own Muslim population, then you're basically just now you believe in not only Cold War, you believe in a hot war, and you're basically just a sycophant of Frank Gaffney.
Right, you're a sycophant of Frank Gaffney or of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies or whatever institute you name it, but once again, this goes back to apparently in the world we live in, two things cannot be true at the same time. It cannot possibly simultaneously be true at the same time that, yes, while indeed there are the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the Frank Gaffneys of the world, the Committee on the Present Danger China of the world, these architects and purveyors of not just the war on terror, but the actual deep ideology behind like the deepest actual meaning of like the war on terror in terms of even beyond like the way like even the Bush administration pointed out. It's really epitomized and reared its ugly head more than ever in the Trump administration. It's not just a war against the terrorists per se, but it's a war, it's a civilizational war. And not only is it in the Middle East, but it's in the West as well. The major part of the propaganda operation to bring Trump into power was the terrorists, bringing the fight not just to the Middle East, but bringing the fight directly to our shores through mass migration into Europe and the San Bernardino attack and the Orlando attack, and the idea that this is not just a war on terror, so to speak, but it's an actual civilizational warfare. And we're not only at war with radical Islam, so to speak, but we're at war with the liberal institutions of the West. We talked about what we went back to earlier. Is there any real distinction between a liberal and a communist, right? So it's the actual, like from a global perspective, the actual epitomization of the worst of the ideology of the actual meaning of like this war on terror from the worst purveyors and architects of it. Just because they're pushing this China threat in a very, very disingenuous, very dishonest manner that is designed to get Americans to view China as their enemy in terms of this artificial, largely fake reliving of the Cold War era tensions, America versus communism, and all this freedom versus tyranny, capitalism versus communism, Judeo-Christianity versus the godless, materialistic, paganistic, whatever you want to call it, values of the rest of the world who does not subscribe to Judeo-Christian American exceptionalism. Just because that's being taken advantage of, can it not also be true that at the same time there's some very, very, very real and very, very serious issues and problems that need to be addressed in a manner that goes beyond the way like the Tucker Carlsons and Frank Gaffneys and Committee on the Present Danger Chinas of the world use and weaponize this problem with their disingenuous bad-jacketing of the narrative. And so apparently we live in a society where two things cannot be true simultaneously. And of course, that's one of the things we don't subscribe to here at the Antidote, where we try to bridge that gap of, yes, these guys are problematic. And at a very deep level, it appears that many of these same interests are actually much like the dynamic we've seen that we've analyzed long term with Russia, Soviet interests. It appears that at the end of the day, there's some strange bedfellows going on here. And I go back once again to that whole dynamic with the arrest of the Chinese national at the day spa within the proximity of Mar-a-Lago, that Robert Kraft, the Patriots owner, was arrested for soliciting sex there, and all of the photos that came out of the prominent GOP figures, right-wing conservative movement figures with this Chinese national. And a number of other things as well. Everything going into the Trump family's own business dealings with the Chinese, the CCP, bring down the CCP, as Steve Bannon and Miles Guo love to tout on their BS program, War Room Pandemic. So,
and by the way, what you showed me, Eric Greitens is now a new voice
on
that
America's America's Voice network, which carries War Room Pandemic. Yes, Eric Greitens, the disgraced former governor, acolyte, peers, protege, and many perhaps of the Makovsky brothers in St. Louis, among other people. And to my point, though, well, it really does appear to be, and we've analyzed this before and we will again, because I still really need to get a stronger perspective on like the Chinese aspect of foreign operation with the Republican Party and its tentacles into bipartisanship with aspects of the Democratic Party as well, but particularly in the strain we were talking about earlier with the GOP. There does appear to be, as much like with the Russians, a strange bedfellows kind of thing where all that it seems to be the real perpetuation and the constant reminder of like just China's become our number one threat and enemy, which we were talking about among ourselves before, seems to be a direct response to, and it's been a narrative that's been out there in the long term for years now, but this most recent stream of China propaganda narrative from the right seems to be a response to what we were talking about earlier with, we might get back into this with the analysis of the some of the incoming Biden Harris cabinet picks on a foreign policy angle later on, but the direct response to this is a pivot to China, which goes back into this whole, some of the stuff you were talking about earlier with the great powers analysis. But anyway, my point is that while by poo-pooing any type of criticism of China and its policies, or any type of, whether it's Uyghur Muslims or whether it's repression or whether it's global scale, the Belt Road Initiative and China's own, you might call them imperialist goals on a global geopolitical perspective. Not only is it morally unacceptable to give a fast to this, but also it's leaving out an important facet of analysis I think needs to be strongly considered, that not all seem to be, even among the China hawks and the Chinese Communist Party in and of itself, and that there's things that need to be analyzed there from a long-term and a short-term perspective of, is this really all it seems to be, or are a lot of these entities batting for the same team at the end of the day, so to speak? So that's another thing that gets lost out of this, like complete poo-pooing of this very real problem that, we have to, unfortunately, we have to at the very least be honest about, much less be equipped to actually understand ways to try and circumvent this, and the very negative global consequences of this entity basically replacing the Yankee go home. Yeah, that sounds great, but what's it going to be replaced by? And so we can't have conversations about these things if we're just poo-pooing the conversation, trying to not have a conversation about it in the first place, which so many people on the anti-imperialist left are not, and aspects of the right as well, like this kind of left-right, anti-war, anti-imperialist perspective do not want to have a conversation.
Anti-regime change war TM and anti-new Cold War TM, basically, where it's not really thought process, it's reactionary horseshoe dynamics that don't really address and break down what I would call, and this could be understood from a left perspective, superstructures. Understand, dig into the superstructures, because once you get into superstructure, you're getting way beyond any kind of thing of the sort of imperialist pole, the imperialist, axis of the world, and then the anti-imperialist pole or axis. No, and this is one of the things that we've been working to unpack, is that to understand the Cold War properly, you have to understand the actual superstructure as an undermining of actual real international diplomatic relations, such as what was beginning to head in that direction in relationship to, people like maybe Kennedy and Khrushchev, and where the so-called hawks surrounding them seem to have intervened in different ways, potentially, maybe very physically. But the main thing was that they, as they're apparently hawks, what they're not, they're really doves to conflict, or they're doves to the perception of conflict, to keep the conflict going so that it escalates all of the usual suspect types, from the military industrial complex, but also the things that are really coming into focus right now, which have to do with surveillance powers, biotyranny, technology. What is the end point? What is the purpose and the end point of cyber technology itself? Who's in control of it? Whose purposes are being served by it? Right. And so then in an American context, you're right into the realm of the question of the Constitution, the struggle over who does the republic belong to? Does it belong from the get-go to a landed elite, or does it really belong to we the people, all of us, even if it's going to take a long time for all of us to claim our right to be at the table? In the basic, in American context, of course, African Americans and women joining their place at the table of being literally seen as part of we the people with the full rights and responsibilities and privileges and politically and all of that. And so that is where the struggle is, I think, in relationship to really unpacking and deconstructing these very toxic, very dangerous, very tyrannical superstructures that are related and engendered by things that we could understand in terms of international, affairs or nationalism or countries or governments and things like that. But there's something going on beyond that, where the apparent standoffs between the hawks is somehow facilitating some greater superstructural plan. And of course, in the mix of all that, this is one of the other reasons why we work to unpack some espionage history too, or deep event and deep state history from during the Cold War, such as these really, even the Kennedy assassination, like we talked about, and we sort of avoided touching on it during this anniversary. We just felt like it was not quite immediately as irrelevant as it needed to be to get our butts in gear to reassess the Kennedy assassination. But it still really is important in terms of understanding the espionage dynamics, because it is in the espionage dynamics that you can read the superstructural interests, the superstructural motives, the transnational motives in such events, right? Looking at people such as James Angleton, and this still not quite yet developed answer to what role did he play in relationship not only to Israel, but in relationship to the backdoor aspects of the Cold War and the Soviet-U.S. dynamics and that whole axis from his buddy Kim Philby near the city of London. Both a Zionist agent and a Soviet agent, but then bring in someone like Victor Rothschild, who is the missing character in that circle, who then really brings in this further longer term strong tie from Israel up through the city of London and then back out to the Soviet Union. And I just want to point out in sort of closing this thought about the dangers of what you are pointing out, Greg, in terms of people shirking the duty to be honest about the totality of the international facts, which includes, talking about China too, or, that Victor Rothschild, the very interesting and very dark background there is not just that he was a Soviet spy, apparently, along with being a Zionist and Israeli spy of some sort, including helping set up the modern incarnation of the Weizmann Institute with Weizmann himself, and which is at the epicenter of this deep science behind Israel's modern weaponry and nuclear program over the longer term, and then ultimately up into the age of bio and cyber and all of that. But I just want to point out that Victor Rothschild also in a UK context, he was not only crucial to some of these questions about, of course, the high level Ted Heath, prime minister associated apparently, child sex ring, pedophile, leverage ops, blackmail operations. Look into that background there. But also he helped set up some of the, I believe maybe the first biotechnology investment, structure company, financial instrument in the world, I think. And one of the things that he did for the Soviets was he was deeply involved in the UK bioweapons lab, the Porton Downs, for decades, really. And apparently, you know, porting out information back to the Soviet sphere. And so I guess the thought that I had was that the danger of being risk averse to dealing with China, for example, is that in a similar fashion to where the sort of silent Democrats, the silent progressives, basically ceded the election fraud landscape to the Sidney Powell Krakens and the Michael Flynns and the McInerney crazy types, you know, basically spinning narrative, just tales, and like you pointed out, Roger Stone and the North Korean ballots and all of that, rather than the much more sober analysis of who did what in 2004 example. What's the nature of these machine rigging? Is it all about dominion and connections to Hugo Chavez's a hungry ghost coming in to eat your ballots? Or is it that all a misdirection, very likely from what are the predominant, this on Friday I called the Idaho, one of the biggest, shifts from 2016 to 2020 in terms of an advantage to Trump was the ton of these southern Texas districts, and Texas basically is all ES&S and Hart Intercivic, and then another one outlying one in terms of these counties around the country, the top 10 in the last maybe 20 years in terms of a shift from one election to the next, was a county in Idaho, and I called them up, and it's ES&S systems there too. And Idaho is actually very similar to Texas, where it's basically split, it looks like, and they haven't published it all on the internet. But someone at the Secretary of State's office in Idaho gave me the list of all the numbers of the county election supervisors. But he says that they're basically Hart, Intercivic, and ES&S. So my point is, instead of that being front and center, that it's very likely actually that people like Lindsey Graham or someone in that realm, Susan Collins maybe, that there is a Senate operation going on, and there was very likely a Trump operation in the opposite direction. Now, I'm not saying there was no sort of Democrat city, ballot fraud or election fraud, or voter fraud. But this stuff is not panning out as when I'm looking at it, it doesn't seem to be panning out. So maybe there's still some inklings that there was something untoward happening in certain places. But when we talk about mass scale, industrial scale, why are the vast networks such as the ES&S, the Hart Intercivics, being totally pointed away from by this red herring stink operation by Sidney Powell? And look at her she has a company called Dominion. That's sort of interesting. Go look that up. Sidney Powell, owner of a company called Dominion. And that's all pointing away from this very, deeply researched background of the, Council for National Policy, the Rove, the Blackwell, the McConnell operations. That's basically now known to some serious extent now around election fraud that actually is used to, fraud at the presidential level in 2004. And of course, these Kerry types, the Democrat types, these progressive sort of silent types that I mentioned, which would include someone like Simone Sanders, as I've talked about before, who was silent on the matter, very actually reactionary on the matter when I questioned about the Bernie Sanders primary in 2016 in relationship to Hillary Clinton and how she's in the communications of the Biden administration. And so that whole crew basically seeded this whole field because they're implicated in some way. There's some kind of thing going on where, we've talked about in different ways, and we'll continue to research this question of, why did Kerry not say something? Is he compromised? Yeah, maybe. They will dig back into that 2002 Epstein-Junkerman incident episode that the the UK estates out in the hills outside of the GCHQ headquarters in Wexner-owned estates in the run-up to the Iraq War. And by the way, remember that whole Wexner War, Frank Luntz, right, a Finky Kid, Arthur Finkelstein operation, that was actually started not in the spring. That was actually started in the fall of 2002. And what we're aware of is that Wexner War document that came out after the war had been launched, where it was leaked to Electronic Intifada, I think, and Ali Abu Nima reported on it in Democracy Now! About how after the Iraq War had been launched, they were working. Frank Luntz was being sponsored by Wexner. And there's actually another group, the Israel Project. You go look at that, the Israel Project. But they were working to figure out how to message, i.e. Frank Luntz is just a pollster. He's just a pollster. No, he's a PR guru. He's a messaging guru. They were studying how are you going to message, and this is all in the Israel lobby, and the U.S. foreign policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, which I've gotten back out because I think it's going to be increasingly relevant in a potential Biden administration, actually.
A real quick note on that book is, I think with the benefit of hindsight, you're sure to find a lot of things that, you probably or did not pick up on the first time you looked through that book, with, all of the years of knowledge and things that, you've come to learn and understand over the past, probably since the last time you read the book. So I imagine a lot of stuff would stick out, the benefit of hindsight from that book with the reassessment of it.
Oh yeah. There's some crazy stuff in it that includes actually this is not in it, but in researching this episode, around the messaging around the Iraq War, then ran back into this question of Makovsky. You mentioned the Makovsky brothers before. They're both brothers from St. Louis, Missouri. The Eric Greitens homelands, and Michael Makovsky, the eventual GINSA executive, who we talked about a lot in relationship to the Gary Vogler book about the politics of oil. And when people can go back to our show titled "The War for Oil for Israel," the Iraq War for Oil for Israel. And Vogler really breaks a lot of it that down. But a lot of that, the basic parameters of the Iraq operation and the parallel intelligence operation that was being run actually had been broken down in the Israel Lobby book more than 10 years earlier. But Makovsky playing this key role in the oil, the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, in managing an oil operation, and what Vogler lays out, and he was very close to all of this, was that this was being done for Israeli partisan reasons. Even the oil aspect of the Iraq war, which the Israel Lobby book points out which took a much deeper back seat, including the whole Halliburton or the military contractor, military industrial complex motive, is way, way back seat. Maybe not even like the oil motive in that context might be non-existent in relationship to the Israel Lobby motive or the Likud Lobby motive. And Makovsky is a interesting character because I think he takes off after high school in America and goes directly to Israel. He works with Shimon Peres. He's identified by Gary Vogler, who has contacts in the U.S. intelligence community, as having spent at least 5 years in the Israeli Foreign Service. And they say 98% of people in Israeli Foreign Service are spooks or spies. Thus, the assertion from Gary Vogler's contacts in the U.S. intelligence community is that Michael Makovsky is a credibly accused Israeli agent of some sort, and he was put at the head of the alleged U.S. Pentagon oil management during the Iraq War. But it turns out that Makovsky, while he was in Israel, he was apparently a buddy. He lived in a West Bank settlement, and he was a apparently a close friend with the accused assassin of Steve Pachenik's target, Rabin, right, yes. Greg?
Yes, indeed.
And so I just, in finishing up, closing the loop of the question of the marketing of the Iraq war, that the Israel Project, I think that's what it's called. Go look at it. It just got shut down in recent years, and it really sort of flew under the radar. But what's very interesting is you remember the woman who asked the question right after me, Greg, when Dennis Ross is, getting off on seeing a self-identified Jewish American man getting hauled out by Israeli partisan paid Homeland Security Fusion Center associated detective and private security contractor for engaging in argumentative discourse, aggressive citizens press, things that are totally protected, the most protected under the First Amendment. While Dennis Ross was like getting off on that, and my wife and I have looked at the video, and it almost looks like potentially Ross is like mouthing potentially like a Yiddish swear word to me or something like that when he's looking at this all going on. And then he finally sort of realizes, oh, maybe I should, continue with the questions. So he turns to the other side, and there's a woman on the other side at the microphone there, the first up on the other side of the microphone. Her name's Karen Pack. And she asked a question about what can we do to combat, the whole UN, the human rights, and that whole agenda, right? Okay. And that's while, we're being forced out, ejected from this public forum, based on political viewpoint, discrimination. And then I and the librarian are arrested. We're charged for over a year. And then meanwhile, this woman, Karen Pack, she worked with this, the Israel Project. I believe probably during the time that it was associated with the Wexner, Foundation and contracting with the question of marketing the Iraq war. But what's not talked about a lot, and it is talked about in the Israel Lobby book, is that before that whole Wexner war Fitrakis episode, they're talking about after the war has begun and, how can we market the Iraq war as, not about Israel's interest, but fully in line with American interests for democracy, expansion and, morality and all of that, that the fall before that, they were actually it was marketing for trying to convince the Israelis and any sort of Israeli partisans to be as quiet as possible in the run-up to the launching of the war, because it was becoming so obvious that it was an Israeli partisan-driven war. And it was basically an open secret in D.C. and in American elite circles. Everybody knew it, right? And even there was a strong push, and we'll return to all of this at another time. But that then lines up with this very strange connection to Epstein and Junkerman and this trip that has been said to have been with two sitting U.S. senators at this Wexner estate in the UK Highlands, fairly close to their NSA headquarters, GCHQ, in the run up to this 2003 launching of the Iraq War. And now just one last thing, and maybe this is a little bit of a retrospective that we're doing, Greg, conceptually, at the end of, the antidote. We've been largely, you founded us, Greg, before Trump came in. But we've been around this whole time, and we've been working on not only excavating facts that are crucial, both in our contemporary moment, but in history, but also working on evolving our analysis so that it can be more clarifying and more helpful towards what the heck is actually going on. And then as a precursor to then what then can we do, or what do we want to do? What do we propose as potentially an alternative, which I imagine we, will just, touch in as we finish up here, as we talk about the potentially incoming Biden, folks Obama tortured some folks. He's always talking about folks and stuff. But, so I'm just, I just want to say that I brought that whole thing up about the potential leverage and compromise the question of 2 sitting U.S. senators in the run-up to the Iraq War. Go back and look at our episode that we did after we attended the documentary about and with it wasn't a documentary, it's actually a feature film about and with Catherine Gunn, the GCHQ key whistleblower in the run-up to the Iraq War. And so this geography of Epstein and Junkerman, and by the way, Junkerman involved with the apparently last sort of largely invested Epstein company before the jail episode in August of 2019, Carbon 911, which is important because it seems very parallel to something like Palantir, which is front and center. There, some of the incoming officials with Biden, including the new National Security Advisor. Is she the National Security Advisor or the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines? I can't remember. Do you remember,
Just
Greg?
a moment.
Okay.
Just a moment.
That's okay. But she worked with Palantir, and at the same time,
Avril Haines is, I believe, the DNI. She would be replacing John Ratcliffe.
Rats off the cliff. So the rats are off the cliff, but meanwhile, then some more organized, competent, nicer types who are nicer when they cover up CIA torture and institute legal architectures of drone strike programs and work with Palantir data military contractors are coming in. And so there's a whole other dynamic here that needs to be looked at very, very specifically and in its own way. And so that question of the compromise of the run up to the Iraq War, I just wanted to complete the thought here. And I'm sorry I'm so all over the place. I feel like I have like about 10 mental tabs open right now that I'm trying to bring back around here.
Still the same way all the time.
Okay. Well, I hope our audience will forgive us, Greg. But my point back to your really important point about the dangers of not addressing China in a serious fashion is that it can lead not only to the question of China, but also it seeds the terrain just as these potentially compromised folks in the terms of even someone up to John Kerry, who, by the way, is in the new incoming Biden administration in terms of a new climate envoy to the UN, that why were they the dogs who didn't bark on what even in this time of a potential election fraud and Nancy Pelosi sitting there, she's totally exposed now. The emperor has no clothes. The mob mayor's daughter has no political clothes. She did not she did not empower the American people with quote unquote stimulus, i.e. our national inheritance in the midst of a likely, it was probably the COVID-19 probably came from an American lab of some sort. And this is all some kind of fallout that's hitting the Americans apparently the hardest in the world. And the leader, so-called, of the opposition party couldn't even get some basic funding to the American people. Dozens of millions who have major food trouble, food shortages. Go look at these massive lines, of people who have fairly nice cars, like, SUVs and nice minivans and stuff like that. But millions and millions of Americans are now food insecure, many of them for the very first time. We've had a food and poverty and food insecurity major mass crisis in the United States for a long time, but now that's escalating. And then you add that to the question of the economics and the rents coming due and evictions in the middle of whether it's the dark winter or the darkest winter, we don't know yet, but it's one of those, it's being identified. And Nancy Pelosi basically refused. It looks like she played politics. She basically refused to make a deal with Mitch McConnell that would benefit her constituents in order to play Trump presidential politics in some way. And now she's saying, well, we're going to make a deal. It's going to be half half as good for the American people, but we have the presidency and we have the vaccines. And that's not going to do anything for the American people during the transition at the very least. And it's also not going to do anything for the American people over the course of this escalating, in terms of destruction, health destruction. And anybody who's still like COVID, quote unquote, denialists, go check in with the nursing community or the frontline healthcare workers in terms of what they are actually dealing with in the midst of people who show up with COVID and they're still in denial that it's actually a thing because Donald Trump told them it was going to disappear someday, and they're dying of COVID while they're still in denial of COVID almost to some extent. So Nancy Pelosi is totally exposed now, and she's submitting her constituents to the darkest winter. Nancy Pelosi voted, and she voted for the darkest winter. And so that's going to have to be addressed. And so that whole crew, basically, when they don't deal with, they seed the field of something like election fraud to the Michael Flynn's and the Krakens. They are doing the same kind of thing that happens in relationship to seeding the whole field around China to the Frank Gaffneys. And then finally, my point is, and this connects back to COVID, that what happened was that instead of the deep investigation that should have been going on from day one, and that started to happen in certain spheres in terms of, there was little bits, fits and starts all around in terms of where did COVID come from? What is it? Was it a lab creation? And that all got totally devolved and upended into anti-maskism and COVID hoaxism. And that is, and part of that, I believe, was the question of China, because what happened is you had the Bannons, basically, and the Tom Cottons, putting the whole question of COVID as a bioweapon, let's say, or an engineered virus potentially, or being used as a weapon of some sort. And they put it all the way into Wuhan and China's hands. And so that basically dirtied that up, and everybody just sort of gave it up. And then succumbed. Those that were in the spheres that originally had gotten to some of the core of this stuff. For example, even someone like Whitney Webb, who wrote some of the most important early articles, like in the early aspects of 2020 in terms of bats, virus engineering, DARPA, that kind of stuff. That was like right in the realm. And then over the course of the year, that kind of journalism was subsumed in many ways by the sort of COVID hoaxers and the anti-maskers, and really irresponsibly so in terms of a lot of those kinds of spheres in terms of what we are actually seeing in an American context. And the racial aspect of this is very difficult to deny too, in terms of the African Americans having been hit really super hard around something like COVID.
And that's really important. I think that's something people need to understand, because my own perspective on this, and we really do need to go back and I want to, before too long, really go back and do a deep dive into COVID and the combination of like what we perceive the reality of COVID to be, combined with what we see as it's very similar to other things that have gone on throughout the era of Trump and the era of the new media and this mass, the COVID narrative. A lot of what we're seeing play out with the COVID narrative, everything from what you're talking about with the taking legitimate questions of bioweapon to, well, it's a hoax, or, no one's really dying, or the masks is wearing a mask in public is the new form of tyranny for the government to, enslave us with or whatnot. And, we do need to go back and do a deep dive into a combination of things regarding that and the propaganda networks that have taken advantage of all these varying narratives, everything from blame China China, as Donald Trump would say. Blame China. China. To blame China all the way to it's a hoax, the masks of the new tyranny, and all of that. So I really want to go back to that. But what you're bringing up with the effect that this is having on particularly aspects of the non-European, non-Caucasian, white American population, particularly African American population, I'm coming to grips with my own realization that the world I live in, Kansas City, Missouri, it's largely confined to family and say a few people who I'm close with outside of my immediate family. But it's a very small world I ultimately live in. As knowledgeable as I like to think I am in terms of the world, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of having a strong, I believe, principled philosophy and outlook on the world and the events going on around us, I really do live in a very small world, and it's confined to a very small group of people in my life. And sometimes I think we lose sight of the fact that what's going on in our world is not indicative of what is going on in the world around us or even in the country around us. And I think it's difficult for a lot of people because, you talk about these racial disparities, and it's difficult for a lot of people to, I think, consciously deal with a mass medical emergency when they don't see it hitting them directly per se. Not to say that could change. I mean, if these, some of the trends that seem to be coming out of places like South Dakota indicate that very well could be changing or has already changed in terms of demographics. But what you're saying, the racial effects, and I think a lot of Americans do not see this because it does not directly affect them, among other things. And I think that's really it's something I think really needs to be, and that's a lot of facets of our society. We don't see what doesn't affect us directly. I, as a Caucasian American, do not per se see what affects other demographic aspects of the population as much as within my little circle in Kansas City. So I'm thinking it's just an example of, and I'm making a big broader statement out of this little point here, but expanding upon just what we're seeing, whether it's within our family circles, whether it's within the media we consume and take in, and seeing things outside of that. And it's hard to do, but that's why it's important to really be grounded, I think, in a combination of, I would say, a serious moral and ethical, empathetic perspective of the world around us, but also moving outside of our own boxes of just combination of what we're comfortable with and what we know, and broadening our horizons on things. And I think that this would really help people to have a grasp of a greater understanding of perhaps what really might be going on with this massive medical crisis, at the very least to say, that is taking place in this country and globally, but particularly in relation to our country. And there's a lot of areas where people would come together on, because I think a combination of a serious response to this medical emergency combined with the very real effects that you're talking about that people are feeling economically, financially, in terms of food shortages, and then even going back to the behavior of the Nancy Pelosi's and the bipartisan disgraceful reaction to all things related to COVID. Everything from the big bailout at the very beginning, which was essentially just a stimulus, which is essentially just a big, once again, another big business bailout, the bipartisan nature of that, and how no questions were allowed to be asked about that, to how from that to the complete, looks like a large scale, just mass fraud grift of the small business loans that were did not go to small businesses. You're starting to see there's more videos coming out of business owners speaking out about the hypocrisy of the fact that these wealthy interests that have the financial means to take care of themselves as it were benefiting more from the allotment of what was supposed to be small business loans than the businesses themselves who were supposed to benefit from this. So I think you really step outside of if it's not easy to do, but I think it's important to try to step outside of your own boundaries of understanding what's going on around us. And I think that something like that could bring a lot of people together in terms of an actual real united front response to the catastrophe going on around us. in so many ways that is affecting us and is going to continue to affect us as time goes on here, as we're in a longer state of very likely extended lockdowns, and the permanent effect it's going to have on everything from business to the way we live our lives in so many different ways and manners.
Well, I appreciate those sentiments, Greg, because I think they're spiritually important right now, especially like there's a lot of trauma that is going on, and of course, people who experience more economic or psychological or biological difficulty or destruction obviously have the most trauma in their families, especially for people who die or commit suicide or who are totally wiped out. They have the biggest burden of trauma. But there's a much bigger scope to this trauma at some level in terms of as a nation and as a world in many ways too. And so I think that perspective that you're bringing to it, to the openness, to me, what it sounds like you're saying is like it's a crucial moment to both open our minds or our eyes to expand our horizons in terms of our familiar surroundings, both physical and intellectual and moral and political, but then to also then at the same time open our hearts, reopen our hearts maybe, which are our hearts maybe, it's possible that you can, like if you're, for example, you're a nurse practitioner who's seeing a lot of, death in body bags, at some level, there's a certain amount of you maintain your humanity, but you also sort of guard your heart potentially just in order to be able to do what you are required to do via your calling, your profession, your human morality, your commitment, any of that combination there. And so I think in the moment that's a good understanding for us, so that it makes sense that we probably have closed off to some extent in relationship to when you have escalating trauma and certain people are being hit harder than you, there is a potentially natural human reaction to guard just so that we can be able to get through what we need to get through for us and ours, and then at the same time we need to then figure out how to proactively and with intent, intentionally reopen both our mind and our hearts to our fellow human beings and to this moment too, because I actually think there's a lot of danger. There's both a lot of danger and there's also a lot of possibility politically that will open up. There's a necessity behind our engagement with the possibility, and a lot of it politically in terms of the pragmatics of how you actually can begin to build a politics that brings people together behind real serious principles and real serious pragmatic solutions that need to be done fairly rapidly in many ways, on a whole lot of scales that we can talk more over the course of this upcoming months and years, that the basis of a lot of that is going to be an opening of one's perspective to others of lots of different backgrounds, and especially political backgrounds or understandings. So I think there's a lot of power in what you just articulated, Greg, and so I appreciate that, and I think that sort of that it feels like a gift of our conversation today is that awareness that you brought to us. So maybe we should just talk another maybe 10, 15 minutes, Greg, on the aspects of the Biden team assembled at this point and what it might mean about what the potential Biden-Harris administration will be about, what it might look like, what things we need to watch out for, where we need to be engaged, and then finish it off. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds good. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just I'll try to be quick in my comments, but I'd like to go back to the domestic moment in terms of what we were talking about before with the, Flynn, McInerney, military types calling for a martial law and what that could possibly lead to. Because I think at this point, I just wanted to go back to this. I think at this point I'm largely with the assessment of our friend John Brisson and his guest on his channel the other night, Billy Ray Valentine, in terms of really this does appear to be like something that's not going to actually come to fruition in this moment, as far as like it's almost the way they described it is like this is almost like testing the waters to see like a reaction to the scenario being floated out there of like a martial law type of military carried out martial law scenario taking place in this country. And so you kind of look at it like that. But a couple things I want to say on this is kind of a follow up to what we were talking about in our last show as well, of like the potential danger of the moment, is that while I think it's unlikely right now in this moment, that like anything other than like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris taking the oath of office on Inauguration Day, is any other scenario seems to be very unlikely to happen outside of that. But while that's the case, there's two things I think we need to be mindful of here. Number one is that we knew that this would be the exact, not necessarily everything that's going on, but we knew in general like how Donald Trump would react to not winning an election. We knew that this was going to be the reaction. This is exactly how he's going to react. He wasn't going to accept it. There's going to be a massive public propaganda effort to ensure that a very large portion of the population does not accept the results no matter what. And so that's definitely been successful, but something that, you knew was going to be coming from the moment it was first believed and seen that Trump was going to have a tough re-election race. I mean, we knew exactly how he would respond, and Trump was not disappointed in the slightest bit with regards to that. And he responded exactly the way you'd expect him to, but he also reacted the way a would-be authoritarian dictator would respond to not winning an election. And so when you talk about like the nightmare scenarios of things that you've never seen, you never imagined coming here to America, that people like, I believe, Sarah Kinzier talk so strongly and with such a prescient perspective on, it's because of trends like this and what it ultimately leads to. And the fact now we've got like military generals talking about floating the idea out there of martial law and what an absolutely nightmarish scenario that would be, because there's no such thing as a limited martial law. If martial law were to be declared so that hypothetically, so that the military could oversee a re-voting, there's going to be nothing limited about that. I mean, it's an absolute, guaranteed recipe for a monstrosity to come upon this society. So out with that. But the last thing is I want to say, like, even if we get out of this moment relatively unscathed, so to speak, if the worst thing that's happening with the this DOD shakeup in the even what you were talking about before, and we'll have to go back to this at some point with the shakeups that went on in terms of the overseeing of aspects of our nuclear stockpile. Even if the worst thing to come out of this is a combination of of preparing the way for massive pardons or whatever, combined with ensuring that that Eric Prince style nationless military contractors are able to go in and replace the U.S. military in some of our overseas endeavors, even if that's the worst consequences at the immediate moment. Long term, when we have such a large portion of the population that will not accept that Donald Trump did not win this presidential election, combined with the more on the surface crazy sounding rhetoric from the Mike Flynns of the world, it could very well just be what you were talking about with the dynamics of creating digital soldiers and all this, and largely something carried out, largely propaganda warfare carried out on the digital sphere. But in terms of a long-term analysis on this, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris taking office in January 2021 does not get us out of the woods. I mean, we are out there where this has been floated as a possible thing to happen by very influential members of the United States military, retired, but still very, very influential. Unless they have large, particularly Michael Flynn's case, who's almost like would be like a godlike figure within like the MAGA Trump base. And that this is being floated out there with millions and millions of people who are prepared to justify pretty much any type of, I hate to say this, but I do not know what length, just how much people would be willing to justify in the name of the election was stolen from us and our president was illegally removed from office, basically as a result of a fraudulent election. So even with the incoming administration actually coming in with all the problems outside of even the problems of like a Biden-Harris administration, I think we'll talk about some of those here in a minute when I'm finished with this. But outside of that, we're not out of the woods, in that we could very well see if this type of talk is being floated around there now. Almost unprecedented, I think, for people within the military to be speaking like this publicly. This is being floated out there. We cannot discount the possibility that in the long term we will see, we could very well see a scenario that you've only heard about happening in banana republics and in other countries throughout the world that is, you could never foresee happening in America. It could never happen here. We cannot dismiss that. And who knows, like, how the escalation of things in terms of the continued sowing of domestic division and the domestic situation getting worse with relation to the ongoing pandemic and everything surrounding that. So, we're in a situation where not just in the immediate future between now and January 20th, but going on from there, where we are facing that we have to really realistically look at some previously unforeseen scenarios happening here domestically.
I totally agree with you that, and I appreciate you following that up, because my sense of the danger of the Michael Flynn hybrid warriors is that even if we do not encounter the worst case scenario during the transition or lack thereof, that they have created such a massive and effective hybrid warrior set, a chaos warfare set in this country to the tune of probably millions and millions and millions of people. And it's not, of course, it's not like all Trump supporters, obviously. It's not that, but there is this very strong base, especially as it was then developed via something like QAnon. And now we see the escalation or the elevation of these.
Real quick, Jeremy, I just want to say you're right. You're absolutely right. It's not every Trump supporter. It's not. But I will say this. I can tell you, like, from, media that I hear and listen to within like the talk radio realm of things, is that while, you're by and large, your mainstream GOP commentators are not going to endorse like, martial law or chaos theories, but also the Rush Limbaughs of the world, Sean Hannity's of the world, they're doing absolutely nothing to try to even alert their audiences that this kind of talk is very seriously going on. So at the very least, even like people who are not privy to having this type of mindset regarding like the way, like the more triggered, social media, people who are very much on social media, who follow things like QAnon, or even some of the more, QAnon light operations that are out there, there's still there's virtually no pushback anywhere from within like the conservative, like Republican sphere against any of this talk that's going on. So I just want to throw it in there.
Oh yeah. And it's definitely a shock. It's a sort of a hybrid warfare shock troop scenario. As you pointed out, we're not just talking about like the grassroots or the militia hills, as might have been talked about like during the Clinton 90s or something like that. And remember how much was made of that in the run up in the deep political run up to the new quote unquote American century in 9/11, with things like the first WTC bombing, but then Oklahoma City, and this really strong focus then on the threat of domestic terrorism, domestic extremism. Now that sort of element, that even just thinking about it as a a concept or a counter gang, counter boogie gang, even, let's say, counter boogie boy or boogaloo boy kind of scenario where it can just basically be pointed at in these coming years, that it creates a massive possibility for, I would call it like, it's almost like a dispersed hybrid warfare tactical nukes in an information warfare kind of scenario. And that's why people who are in full denial about how foreign this was, or this is, as you pointed out on C-SPAN, in all of its elements, and how it's fused with these domestic elements, and how Russian this was, how Israeli this was. People who are in denial of any of those elements don't really understand how potentially dangerous this existing hybrid shock troop set really potentially is, especially then when you layer on top of it, just as you said, this is like, not reserved to shortwave radio. This is the commanding heights of like corporate right-wing radio. This is now at the commanding heights of the Pentagon. This is the commanding heights of generals who are saying this kind of stuff out loud, who are part and parcel of this ongoing threat in many ways, right? And so that's continues. And so no matter what happens in the next month and a half here, or through the rest of the quote unquote dark winter to darkest winter or whatever, and how we move out of that and how we then address what comes after that, there's going to be this political situation here. And that's totally, not even dealing with what then those that are now coming into executive branch power represent in terms of the dangers.
All right. So I guess we'll, wrap this recording up with with talking about the incoming administration, particularly some of the picks from the foreign policy side of things, and
let's just deal with Blinken.
Yes, let's get into it.
And that's it. But he can be a sort of touch point for what is represented, I think. And I think it's totally fair because his group, this WestExec consulting company that he started with Michelle Flournoy, that includes a whole set of people, including Dennis Ross. And it's interesting, Dennis Ross is identified as the mole, the neocon mole in the Obama 1 administration, which makes total sense when you look at the incoming people.
Even Aaron David Miller, who is not anti-Israel by any stretch of imagination, basically publicly said Dennis Ross is an agent for Israel. So.
Or he didn't say an agent. He said that he acted as Israel's lawyer, I think is sort of.
As Israel's lawyer, which is,
which is acting as Israel's agent. But he didn't necessarily say it at that closely.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, no. I agree with you. I agree. You're right.
No, but in general, you're right. And then and the closeness, I would just say the closeness of Dennis Ross to the Makovskis, very close to the Makovskis, suggests a very close relationship to those who, such as a Michael Makovsky, who have apparently been identified by, the U.S. intelligence community as verified agents of a foreign government, Israel. Okay. All right. So there is that. And so Dennis Ross is part of this Blinken set WestExec, group. And I think I think a lot can be surmised from the way that they did their announcement and what Blinken said when Biden handed it over to him. And Blinken told a story about his stepfather, I believe it was, and he didn't name him, but the architecture here is very much in line with what the marketing behind Obama Harris is, which is very restoring Americana ideals and Americana stories, and people who come up through difficulty, and immigrants who make it good and make it big, and competency, and we're back, we're going to build back better. And then layered on top of all of that is a sort of pseudo institutionalized wokeness, sort of super identity politics, almost used as like human shields in a way to defend against criticism. And it's going to look like America. But is it going to be representative of America? No, it's just going to look like America is basically what it seems like is the sort of the surface presentation of their marketing here. But meanwhile, it's, the national security set here is Blinken and Blinken's Flournoy WestExec set, where they are working with foreign companies. They apparently work with this, what they call an Israeli artificial intelligence company, but it looks like it's a parallel or a competitor to Ghislaine Maxwell's boyfriend / maybe pseudo husband of some sort, Scott Borgerson, that we covered after Maxwell was arrested, I think. Oh no, actually we covered that before she was arrested. That Cargometrics, right? Artificial intelligence applied to big data analysis of shipping, of global shipping. And so this company that Blinken and crew represented via WestExec is let's see, what's the name of that company? I can't remember.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Greg. And David Cohen, who's the deputy director, the former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 2015 to 2017. He got the nickname of the sanctions guru at Treasury, very crucial to the post 9/11 era. He's part of the WestExec crew, and the name is basically about that they are highly seasoned veterans of the executive branch and the White House, and they cross that street there next to the White House many times, basically WestExec, and so that's the naming of it. And it's what's interesting too is one of their strategic partners is the Boston Consulting Group, right, which is parallel to the background of Baines and all of that. I'm trying to get the name of this Israeli company, but I can't find it right now. It's all right.
In a moment, I could look for it here. I'll find it here in a minute.
Okay, I'll just keep going. I want to go back to this announcement of Blinken that really puts the whole sort of network in many ways together, right? So as they are announcing, there's going to be a woman who's going to head national intelligence. There's going to be African American woman. There's going to be a Mexican American, I think, or maybe a Cuban American in charge of Homeland Security. And a lot of Jewish Zionists all around too. So it's going on here too. But Blinken himself tells the story of his father-in-law or stepfather, and this very Americana story, of he escaped a concentration camp at the end of World War II in the European theater, and he ran into the woods or something like that, and then he was just waiting there all alone as a boy or young or something like that, and he saw this just beautiful image of American soldiers coming up the road, and they saved him, and then he basically, and then I became, now here I am, with just being so well entrusted by you, President-elect Biden. And meanwhile, he never identifies who that stepfather is. And the stepfather's name is Samuel Pisar, who turns out to be the longtime lawyer and confidant of Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, the Israel super spy, and apparently the guy who was the last person to speak to Robert Maxwell apparently alive. So there's a lot of stuff loaded in there with that all being that whole background there of Maxwell's wingman with a daughter now in prison apparently being there's still almost no talk at a high level in terms of that this was some kind of Israeli intelligence blackmail operation, Epstein and Maxwell. There's the whole even deeper, darker background in terms of the Promise software and Israel as a cutout in many ways, and Maxwell's relationship to the Soviet sphere even, and the Maxwell sons working with the Mogilevich set really, in terms of, financial instruments in relationship to moving money into the Israeli political sphere, that whole Natan Sharansky, Red Mafia question in the background there. But then meanwhile, also, it turns out that Blinken's biological father, his name's Donald Blinken. He doesn't mention him. Donald Meyer Blinken is a leader in the fields of investment banking, education, and arts patronage. Right? Remember the whole thing about the generations of the money and the washing of the money and where eventually just goes from it goes from sort of black economics into mob into financial arenas, and then into it's just all about philanthropy, right? Okay. So that's a parallel, but I'm just saying it's similar. Okay. So Blinken's biological father, he was a director and one of the founders of E.M. Warburg Pincus and Company, an investment bank in New York, was the board chairman of the State University of New York from 1978 to 1990, an American ambassador to Hungary from 1994 to 1998. And there's some background on Hungary that we'll get into in the future that that's interesting around this question of drugs, pharmaceuticals, opiates, Teva Pharmaceuticals, Israeli pharmaceuticals company, the question of biological warfare, I would say, and the epicenter of Teva Pharmaceuticals in Hungary, by the way. And by the way, I think it was maybe even during the early years of Trump administration that the Hungarian ambassador to the United States was a former Teva pharmaceutical executive. All right. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the background there that we'll get into get to in the future. But I would just say this locus of Hungary, 1994 to 1998, go read Budapest Bridge, those series of articles and go to the background of all of that. Right. So I think there's something there. But then just think about E.M. Warburg Pincus and Company, that he didn't, that Blinken basically does this whole thing about his stepfather coming in from, Europe after World War II, and that whole, the beauty of the American military saving this boy. And then meanwhile, the biological father is already in New York setting up what becomes the lineage of people like Tim Geithner. But you just think about Warburg, right? I think he sets this up with, the son of, Eric Warburg. In 1939, this is Warburg Pincus. The Blinken's father set this up. In 1939, Eric Warburg of the Warburg banking family founded a company under the name E.M. Warburg and Company. Its first address was 52 William Street, New York, the Kuhn Loeb building. All right, so there's all that. We can go into that. It's, all around the world, Europe, India, China, Warburg, big. That's one of probably the most major global banking families in terms of, like, if you want to get into the background of all of the spheres, if you want to talk about the American Federal Reserve, you want to talk about Germany, you want to talk about Russia, the Soviet Union.
So this is,
look at that.
In many ways, in continuity of one of the bastions, so to speak, of the, I guess, of what you might call an aspect of conspiracy culture is very much focused on bankers, so to speak, the Federal Reserve, but that there's a very serious, strong element of truth and serious inquiry to outside of the way. Like a name such as Warburg is obviously weaponized in many ways, shapes, and forms. But this is a continuity of that with a very, very, very strong Israeli component to it that's going to have a very, very serious effect on, in terms of our, not just in terms of our domestic economic policy, but in terms of the direction of, U.S. foreign policy, global policy is going to be headed.
Yes, and I think we'll continue exploring that aspect, but that's my immediate sense of what this really represents. Is it's not what some people are still in denial about the very Russian aspect to the Trump administration, Trump regime, whatever you want to call it. That looks like it might be on its way out. It hasn't admitted it yet, and it's still running slop ops. And maybe there's something worse immediately, but I sort of have this sense, right? So what's coming back in is something what we might call the paleo neocons, which we, came up with that concept to clarify what the heck was who were these neocons that were against Donald Trump from the beginning or from before, and how were they different from this other set of what could be called neocons that were fully riding the Trump horse to some other kind of goal. And so what we see here is the older school, maybe the paleo neocon, American neoliberal establishment, foreign policy consensus types back in the saddle potentially. And they are, they can be pointed to as being much more, experienced and much more effective and more American in their institutional outlook. And a lot of that is true. And at the same time, as there is an engagement into this next, generation of global conflict, so-called, right, past the global war on terror one now into this great power conflict. This is now, I think, the emphasis on the question of the American establishment and its relationship specifically with Israel. And the background, this is partially why I was talking a lot about the origins of the Iraq War. This is going to come immediately back into focus, and we need to really bring it back and put it on the table. And of course, 9/11 needs to then again be put firmly back on the table. And, this is one of the proper serious criticisms of the whole Biden set from everyone from the, good faith, Trump voters to the left and the Bernie supporters and all of that, is the question of the Iraq War. Blinken was deeply in the mix in relationship to then Senator Biden and his backing of the Iraq War. And so this is going to need to be unpacked, and especially in this really global relationship of China, especially Israel, China, the U.S., Israel, China, and then what kind of proposal is there that could be said to be beyond this pseudo dialectic of different sort of flavors of neocons, really, at some level, and there is one. And it's also embraces the possibility of American Renaissance, of even what you might say American global leadership, but it has nothing to do with the question of either of the return in many ways. And I think they're hoping to do here is like, let's just forget about that whole Iraq war, biggest quote unquote blunder. We did a whole show about when it came out about the blunder. It was not a blunder. It was it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest sort of crimes against humanity in this century, the Iraq war. And it was also a geostrategic, quote unquote, error of massive proportions from the American imperial perspective even. And it was not a blunder because that's why we have to deal again with the nuts and bolts of the Israel lobby, the book, the whole scenario, and then add on top of that the question of technology transfer, cyber, Talpiot, Hugent inserts the combination of human intelligence and SIGINT into the heart of Silicon Valley. We, also already saw this question of the Jedi cloud being transferred in a very strange way by the Trump regime to Microsoft, Adelome, Talpiot, Unit 8200. So that is all going to be like immediately on the table in relationship to this moment that I believe they are going to try to recreate of, no, for real. This is real. No, we messed up for the first fifth of the new American century, but let's forget about the whole endless war and the Iraq war blunder and the stumble and the 20 years of millions of lives destroyed and the looting and plundering of the American resources and American morality and credibility on top of all of that. And let's really do it. Let's make this the real American unipolar moment. And it's going to be done under the guise of a multipolar architecture, but that will be seen as the United States recreating a new global, alliance of some sort that, and it'll be India in relationship to the pivot to Asia, to the pivot to, China. Oh. And it's going to be Japan, Australia, India, and they're going to assemble this. That's going to be the new multipolar order that's going to try to extend that's going to be the guise under which the American unipolar moment is going to be attempted to be, extended. And meanwhile, I think we need to propose the kinds of things that were being looked at by the era of the Khrushchevs and the Kennedys, where there are much bigger issues facing humanity beyond which nation state is going to dominate the other's sphere. And sure, I don't think we want to, we don't want to shy away from the question of China, but we also don't want to shy away from the question of the threat of the American sort of surveillance state unipolar moment to be led by Eric Schmidt and Google, who are being brought into this administration. I'll give them a little chance, this Biden administration, before I call them regime. We'll see how long that lasts.
And following up on what you said there regarding the it made me think when you talked about like this new push for like forget about the mistakes of the past. We're really seriously going to do the right thing this time. And I was thinking about that because it's an interesting dynamic that I think you might see a serious concerted propaganda effort to promote within aspects of, the media, the, democratic, more liberal establishment, the combination of like the neoliberals and the paleo-conservatives, right? Those who are like what we've come to coin the phrase of the paleo-conservatives and their respective...
The paleo-neo-conservatives.
Paleo-neocons, I'm sorry. Yes, paleo-neo-conservatives, yes. And their respective, mouthpieces in media and in other areas of our society. I think we could very well see like a prolonged propaganda effort where it'll be almost like a reversal of, it'll be kind of what you saw with Obama in the aftermath of Bush, but even more pronounced now with the aftermath of Donald Trump. And that is a scenario where you go from the Americans being obviously just how despised and disliked the U.S. was around the globe because of the criminality of the Bush administration, right? Obviously there was still crimes taking place under the Obama administration, but it was a pronounced drawing down of like the overt, blatant war crimes of the Bush era. And then with Trump,
until it was escalated under Obama. Well, but you're right though, in terms of the front end of it is we're gonna draw down, we're gonna be more humble, we're gonna be more respectable and respectful. Right. And then the whole thing escalates into sort of drone legal architectures and Libya.
Yeah, but I mean, from that regard, like
Syria.
I think the perception of the Obama administration was it was less openly like criminal in terms of its carrying out of things as far as compared to the ugliness of the Bush administration. I mean, you're right, but the perception's what I'm going by here. And then, you have Trump that comes in, and Trump just like completely destroys, going back to that conversation of norms, right? The norms, both domestically and globally. In America, the U.S. is the enemy again. So I think you're going to see a prolonged campaign to, now that Biden's in, now that the Democrats are in and Trump is gone, America is the good guy in the world again, and the world can trust American global leadership again to do the right things, which goes right in with regards to the forget the mistakes we made in the past. We're beyond that now. But with Trump gone, post-Trump, the world can trust the Americans to do the right thing again. I think you're going to see a strong propaganda push for that here in the next few years.
I think you're completely right. And this is all like putting aside the question that we dealt with before about this Avril Haines selection suggests that this is once again the Obama Bush era, as you identified, that there is a sort of, at least for the aspects of the world who are looking for what looks to be a bit saner presenting, a little less criminal presenting leadership. And as that's happening, then there's all the look forward, not backwards. And so the Avril Haines apparently being a leader in making sure there was not either transparency or accountability in relationship to the Bush era CIA torture crimes. Right. And actually, then we pointed this out very early, actually, during the Trump era. And maybe we actually did it during our show. We did a show about Obama and Obama's relationship a lot with Israel and Zionism. And what's interesting now, Obama has his new book. We'll talk more about Obama in the future, I think, but he has his new book out where he discusses pretty openly, the power, the Israel lobby power in relation, and Netanyahu and all of that, and discussing it, way too late, really, in terms of having some public discourse serious effect when it would have mattered, which is when it was happening, bro, and so, there is that aspect where they decided, Avril Haines and this whole Obama thing, that in so doing, to try to look forward rather than backwards, they actually set up not only the situation where they escalated a torture program into not only a physically escalated, but a legally escalated drone program, which Avril Haines did a lot of the legal architecture for. And I believe she actually was as legally careful as they say that she was in architecting it. However, what it did was it just escalated the machinery of death. And instead of, Obama saying that he had black sites and was filling up Guantanamo again, he basically solved that problem politically by incinerating people at weddings and killing children, right? And now what? And this should be really hung around the neck of like this whole crew, and the Obama crew is now under someone like a Trump. It's been escalated, but we have no clue how much it's been escalated. We have a sense it's been escalated severely, actually, but because it's been made even more covert in many ways. And so we've heard less and less about it, so that even like people who should know a lot better are still calling Trump some kind of, anti-war president, when he took the Obama administration legal architecture for the drone program that killed, they say, high hundreds, but it was thousands, very likely. And they've escalated that, under Trump. And now these quote unquote legal architecture of it is probably like, okay, all right, just to do it, I mean, there's probably very little legal quote unquote architecture behind the escalation of the terror war drone program. And so that is a lot of the danger of this moment. And I think, and that's where my sense of it is that the early look forward, not backwards scenario in Obama administration led to the violent escalations in relationship to around the world, in Libya and Syria and Yemen and all of that.
And I think perhaps the beginning to close it up here, that is why we cannot allow history to repeat itself and just let the last few years, and obviously even everything even going back before that, much less why we can't do it, why we cannot afford to have another moment like when Obama came into office and the past was completely forgotten about and just swept under the rug, because the more and more this continues to happen, it's a guarantee at this point that if the crimes and everything that's going on in this country right now, of the 2016 operation, of everything that happened before that and since, is not dealt with and honestly addressed in a very serious manner that ensures that that there are aspects of justice that are served, but also serious conversations about how this cannot happen again, then it is destined and doomed to repeat itself. And when it does come back, when you do have whatever the next step is after Trump of this operation, it's guaranteed to come back, and history, by all indications, it's almost guaranteed to be, it's a very strong chance that it'll come back and be even worse than it is right now. So it is absolutely imperative to not make the past and instead deal with it head on and in a very, very serious manner. And that's an understatement, but yeah, not dealing with it is going to guarantee that it continues on and that it rears its ugly head in a very, very bad way. It's probably sooner than later.
And that the what's quote unquote normalized is highly criminal. And that is very likely one of the motivators behind the perpetual lack of accountability at the highest levels in our society, obviously. Just the Maxwell question, the Epstein question, is so relevant at this point. The combination of the question of the Iraq War, of Israeli intelligence's involvement in all of that, the question of leverage that has still not been explained in relationship to that, or the 2004 election mid-Iraq war, where Kerry, then Skull and Bones Kerry, said nothing in the midst of election fraud. So all of that is just is a mass criminality, and then you factor in that this is the cyber age, and that is the Maxwell Epstein network, from Epstein's work at MIT, right? His investments in people at MIT, the close-knit relationship to Silicon Valley, to scientists, to Maxwell and the Maxwell sisters, deep involvement in real core cyber technology, post 9/11 stuff incorporated into the FBI, Israeli intelligence investment vehicles, deep Isabel, I believe, Maxwell relationship with Microsoft and Bill Gates. So that's a crucial thing to hold in focus right now, I think. And so this now linkage of Blinken to Robert Maxwell, familial linkage to Robert Maxwell, is crucial, I think, to focus on, not just as a singular fact, but as representative of this quote unquote normalized corrupt establishment. And also I agree too that there needs to be a focus in the moment on not allowing it to be forgotten what just was done criminally. And that, of course, is the question of accountability immediately in relationship to the 11/9 global mob Trump operation, right immediately after the last bits of its fits of Trump pump and dump slop ops on their way out. Okay. So at the same time, Flournoy, Blinken, this whole set here that's being set up here, needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And we need to further expand the awareness and understanding specifically of this very, very dark relationship between the U.S. and Israel and the power dynamics that underlie a lot of that. And the question of whether we are going to engage in the crisis of we have crises of our moment that are severe and require very quick action at a very large scale, or scaled up. Let's say we can do it on a localized but scaled up through state, national, international levels in terms of a combination of economy, ecology, and technology, and major decisions about the future of our country, about the future of humanity, about the future of our humanness are going to be made in this coming decade, really. And so we need to be up to that challenge in the time scheme that we need to be up to it, and make sure that the answers to those challenges are being met with a question of morality, political sovereignty of we the people, and then spiritual dignity fully in the mix. And that's only going to happen if we the people, and I don't mean just here in we the people in the Republic of the United States of America, but we the people worldwide, whether we are, get our act together in time. So I appreciate our conversation, Greg.
Yep. I think this is a perfect point to finish this conversation for now. And thank you thank you as always for doing this. And, we'll be back very soon. We're, definitely talking about, more of the events of our moment. But, I'll just wrap up by saying that while there's, always reasons for pessimism, and there's also reasons for optimism, particularly like right now. Like there's a great opportunity for some serious, I think, we always talk about this, but right now in this moment, I think we're heading into barring some type of ridiculous, unforeseen events, outside of that, we're heading into a post-Trump era. And I think a lot of people are ready for conversations, and they're very serious, people, as far as like even reaching out to jilted aspects of the Trump base, who see that none of these promises are coming to fruition, combined with a combination of, very serious, astute observers of the Trump era, and also elements of the Democratic base that are very disenchanted with the prospects of what a Biden-Harris administration is going to bring. It's a very interesting time to be, I think, to really have dialogue with people about the events of our time. And I think we say this all the time, but I think right now there are a lot of really big openings with that regard. So that's a reason to be optimistic in this moment.
Yeah, or at least hopeful.
Hopeful, I guess. All right. Thank you, my friend, and we'll do this again very soon.
All right. Thank you, Greg, my friend. All right. Bye, y'all. Antidote, we out.